Virtually everything that can be said about our guest tonight, Marjorie Taylor Greene, has been said, often without the slightest regard for whether or not it is true. But whatever one's views of her may be, there is no denying that in a very short period of time, she is just now entering her second term in Congress, she has become one of the most prominent, influential, and popular politicians in America. As the New York Times recounted in an article on her complex history with current House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, when Democrats were plotting to strip her of all of her committee assignments due to controversial comments she made on the internet before she was even elected to Congress, she, quote, stormed into Mr. McCarthy's office in the Capitol late one night in February 2021 and handed him a letter signed by local Republican leaders in her district urging him to keep her on committees. They had received, quote, countless messages, they said, from their voters who were intent on supporting her. Many things interest me about the Republican Congresswoman representing Georgia's 14th congressional district. Her strident opposition to bipartisan foreign policy orthodoxy in Washington, the still escalating U.S. role in the war in Ukraine, her opposition to the evils of the U.S. security state and big tech, all of which we'll talk about. But one often overlooked aspect of her quick rise to prominence is the founder's aspiration to have a country free of a professionalized political class, but instead one that would be governed by citizen legislators, people who have other jobs and professions beyond politician, and who go to Washington for a few years after a lot of experience elsewhere to serve in the model of public service and then go back to their regular lives. Anyone who was able to construct a prominent political profile without decades of striving for political power, without drearily climbing the careers ladder from low-level political office and trying to take a step up every few years, without the benefit of a famous political parent or a famous family name. In other words, a self-made person in Washington is automatically someone who will be of greater interest to me than people who seemingly popped out of the womb dreaming of one day being in the U.S. Senate. Whatever else one might think of Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, if that's true of her, and it's at least equally true of Congresswoman Greene. Look at the two most senior politicians who lead their respective parties in the Senate. Republican leader Mitch McConnell has been a senator since 1985 for almost 40 years. Other than a few years in the early 1970s when he worked as a lawyer, McConnell has never had any job outside of being a politician. The Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer, was elected to the New York State Assembly at the age of 24. He was elected to the U.S. Congress in 1980 at the age of 30, and then to the U.S. Senate in 1999. He's been in Congress for 43 years. It's impossible to find people more insular and insulated and aberrational than they. Their lives bear not even the slightest resemblance to those who they pretend to represent. When AOC first ran for Congress in 2018, almost nobody paid attention to her primary race, in large part because nobody had even heard of her opponent, Joe Crowley. That was the case even though Crowley was one of the most powerful members of Congress, entrenched in House Democratic leadership and touted as the likely successor to Nancy Pelosi. But almost nobody in his district even knew who he was. He barely visited Queens, the district he nominally represented. There was no such thing as a Joe Crowley supporter. His extremely significant power had nothing to do with any popular support. He had none. And it had everything to do with his ability to navigate the back rooms of Congress, where lobbyists for Google and Raytheon lurk, telling party leadership, both parties, what they want as they hand over massive checks to fill their war chests. That's the reality of how Washington works and has worked for decades in both parties. Marjorie Taylor Greene's power comes exclusively from popular support. Her relevance depends only upon one thing: the fact that whether you like it or not, millions of Americans trust her, support her, and will stand behind her. And that's what should matter. Regardless of what you think about her causes and her ideology, and she is, needless to say, a deeply polarizing figure, as is almost everyone who holds genuinely passionate convictions as a matter of principle, I think one could say without much controversy that she's the most organic and authentic representation in Congress of the MAGA movement that attracted the support of tens of millions of Americans from every walk of life, from every racial and ethnic group, and from every part of the country. And that just has to matter in politics, the fact that someone actually has large amounts of popular support. In Washington, for those who know how to wield it, and she has learned a lot about how to do so in the past 2 years. That's real power. There was a reason that, quote, citizen legislators, rather than a professionalized political class, was what the founders envisioned. By definition, people who have lived most of their lives without political power and political office have far more in common with those they are supposed to represent. They tend to be far more willing to learn, to grow, to evolve, not as the result of calculating careerist decisions, but simply because people who arrive in Washington afresh are not yet dependent upon it. They typically end up seeing things and learning things about how the country really works, and that in turn makes them less captive to party and dogma and more open to growth and change. Congresswoman Greene is no ordinary member of Congress, and she's no ordinary Republican either. Many of her most passionately held views are ones that were utterly anathema to the Republican Party until Donald Trump came along in 2016 and became the Republican nominee for president, not by affirming and validating longstanding Republican orthodoxies. Voters already had Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio if they wanted that, but instead by denouncing and vowing to uproot his own party's establishment orthodoxies. And for that reason, Greene often inspires more anger and contempt in establishment Republican circles than she does among American liberals. Many of her views, her worldview, and her approach to politics is a threat to subvert the GOP establishment. And they know that. And that's why many of them despise her. But conservative voters also know that she's a threat to subvert the GOP establishment. And that's why so many of them trust and support her. There's a lot more views I have to share about Congresswoman Greene, but rather than taking more time for me to express those, I'd rather spend our time letting her speak for herself. I'm thrilled that she's here tonight to do just that. Congresswoman, good evening. It's great to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Hi, Glenn. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I was just talking about one of the things that I find interesting about your rise to prominence in such a short period of time, which is the pre-political trajectory you had. You didn't spend a lot of time plotting how to get elected to politics. You never ran for office previously. You had what I would describe as a life that has a lot in common with ordinary Americans. Talk about, just in general, what your life was before you became Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene and how that shapes the work you do in Washington.
Well, I am just a regular American. I'd never been in politics before, never held political office. I never even went to a local GOP meeting. As a matter of fact, I'm a business owner, very proud mom. That's the best part of my life. And I just became angry over time with the failures that I saw in Washington, D.C., that regular Americans were able to get done every single day in our normal lives. Being a business owner and growing up in a family business, serving our customer was the most important thing we could do. I was raised with the belief that customer is king, and I see the American taxpayer as the customer of the federal government. But I see complete failure from our federal government, and we're basically on the brink of falling apart. So I decided that instead of complaining on Facebook or social media or to my friends, that I thought, okay, I'll step up to the plate and take a swing at this and see if I can do a better job.
So speaking of Facebook and social media and the like, and your use of it before you got to Congress, it's part of what makes you polarizing in certain circles that you said and published things on those platforms that you ultimately came to disregard and repudiate. It's a experience I know I had too when I was a lawyer, and I then first became a journalist and was able to kind of delve into, in a full-time way, political realities. I realized that a lot of things I had been led to believe previously, when I was just kind of being able to only pay partial attention, turned out to be untrue. I think it's true for everybody. What's rare is to actually acknowledge and admit that, as you've done. Talk a little bit about that process, what that was like to kind of navigate through things you believe, come to reaffirm some of them, reject others of them. What has that process been like for you?
Well, it's been honestly a really easy one, Glenn, and I'll tell you why. You see, it's not just people on the right, it's people on the left that are victims of conspiracy theories all over the internet and social media. So I did go through a process where I had to say, look, I'm sorry, I said a few things on social media. But to be honest with you, as a regular American, when you look at Washington, D.C., it doesn't make sense why we're in such pitiful debt that we're in, when as an American at home, I could pay my bills every day and was able to save money, and I wasn't in debt, and I'm not in debt now. And then looking also at our government failures, it's like, why doesn't our government care about our southern border or our border period, but yet we're obsessed with every other country's border across the world? And there were just so many injustices. It's easy to believe things that you read on the internet. There's a lot of people that believe insane lies about me that they read on social media and the internet. And then we have major media companies, large corporations that have told lies every single day, 24/7 on cable news, not only to Americans, but all over the world. And so, I think everyone is a little bit of a victim of so-called misinformation. But I don't think that's anything to be totally ashamed of, but it's real easy to say you're sorry and move forward. Who I am as a person, I've never broken a law. I've always paid my taxes. I've done everything right in my life, and I'm pretty successful, and I'm proud of that. If I believed something wrong and had to say I'm sorry for it, well, you know what? Everyone makes mistakes.
Yeah, it was very interesting when we announced that I was going to be speaking to you tonight. There was a wide range of reactions, including rage, as you might imagine. The idea that a journalist would actually interview a member of Congress apparently has become something that is now regarded as immoral or a cause of anger. But one of the things that also I found very bizarre about the reaction, saying, oh, why would you talk to her? She spread conspiracy theories, is you want to talk about deranged conspiracy theories. What prompted me to get into politics and journalism was the fact that I watched every major American institution endorse what turned out to be an outright falsehood, namely that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons or biological and chemical weapons programs that led to a war that killed in excess of 1 million people, depending on how you count. All of those people who did that are now in all of the respectable precincts, welcomed on every show. We had a 2008 financial crisis that wiped out generational wealth for millions of Americans. And then we spent the last 4 years hearing the most prominent members of society, the most prestigious media outlets, claiming that the Kremlin had taken over the United States, had seized control of the levers of power. Do you think that one of the reasons why Americans fall victim to conspiracy theories that aren't true, as you've acknowledged was true of you, is because there has been such a breakdown of trust in institutional authority and the legitimacy of institutions that on some level, people don't know what to believe any longer?
Yeah, I think that's so true and so well said. I really appreciate the way you put that. And I share a lot of what you said. I mean, here our country after 9/11 went straight into war looking for so-called weapons of mass destruction. And we didn't find any. But we lost thousands of lives, of American military lives. And we saw our brothers and friends and cousins and uncles and fathers come back home maimed, disfigured, and suffering from PTSD and committing suicide. And, there's so many things that we have been told are true by our trusted leaders, but then we watch things unfold, and, it ends up being where things don't add up, and people don't know what to believe anymore. I mean, we can talk about, here's things that have been said about me that are absolutely shocking to me. Every single day, if I look in my comments, someone will accuse me of being the pipe bomber on January 5th. And that's absurd. But there's a whole bunch of people that believe it, a bunch of Hollywood celebrities and so-called smart people, probably some of the people that were outraged that you would dare interview me on your show. Every single day, there's people that think that I said a phrase called Jewish space lasers, a phrase that I never said. As a matter of fact, it was created and invented in a story that a bunch of people read in the news and they believe that about me. But in fact, that's something I never said. And I don't hold any types of beliefs like that at all. But no, we look at our leaders in Washington, and we should be able to trust our leaders in Washington. We should be able to trust all of our leaders and believe what they tell us and trust them that they're going to do a good job. But they haven't done it for so long now that they have failed us. And people are grasping. No matter where they are in the political spectrum, they're grasping and trying to figure out, well, what do we believe and who do we believe? And I believe it's causing a very dangerous situation in a certain percentage of our population, where they're becoming so fed up and so angry that they don't believe anyone. And they can't be satisfied no matter what solution you present. No matter what you tell them, even if you're telling them the straight facts, they still don't believe you. And so I think we're going down a very dangerous road, but this is what happens when governments fail their people so severely. We're over $34 trillion in debt, Glenn, and we're looking at having to raise our debt ceiling again so that we don't default, and that's extremely important. But at the same time, we're having to fight our president, President Biden, over reducing spending, which is hard to fathom because, just as you listed, this man has spent decades in Washington and he can't connect with regular Americans like I can. And he can't even figure out, like why people think this overspending is a problem. He's more interested in what's happening over in Ukraine and figuring out how to get Crimea. And he's willing to go as far as possible. I mean, maybe even nuclear in order to do that. But yet he's disconnected with what's happening at the southern border. He doesn't care that people are dying of fentanyl every single day. He doesn't care that over 5 million people are flooding into our country. And he doesn't understand why the youth, the young people, young adults in this nation aren't pursuing jobs and careers. So I think there is such a disconnect between our so-called leaders who people should trust and what they believe on the internet, to the point where, think about this, Glenn, people will believe a perfect stranger that they have never met in their life, that may have some kind of interesting name that they call themselves, and because they have a podcast, not only will they believe them, but they'll donate money to them. And I think that's a very dangerous place for us to be.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, I think, history and see societal breakdown and genuine civic strife, it's almost always because there becomes this breach, this enormous gap between how elites are living, kind of the classic walled behind, the Versailles of France, and the entire rest of the population. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.